Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Today, we are diving into the Mobius Book by Lacey. I was pretty sure when I very first read about this book and read about the formal elements, the fact that it really is a memoir together with a novella, I assumed that PhD in literature was really going to be put to the test. And I had such an interesting experience of the book, so I'm very pleased to dive into it with you all today. A couple of super quick housekeeping notes. One is that if you are listening on a podcast and you feel like watching these lectures on YouTube, that is a possibility. The lecture today does not lend itself to a lot of photographs, but there are definitely books where the YouTube lecture ends up containing all sorts of visual elements that I feather in throughout. It is so fun for me, and I think viewers really appreciate it. If you are watching on YouTube and you feel like taking the show on the road, you can always listen to it as a podcast. It's the exact same lecture as a podcast anywhere you listen to your podcasts. I also haven't mentioned for quite some time what the foxed page means. The foxed page comes from the idea of foxing. So foxing is just the aging, the little age spots that we would find on the pages and on the covers of very old, very beloved books. So today, I'm really excited to talk about Lacey's The Mobius Book. This is a book that is formally inventive. And when I say formally there, I simply mean in terms of its form. And I will admit that formal invention was really the main reason why I picked up the book. I think that my experience of the Mobius Book was both helped and hurt by the fact that I had just finished reading Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. That is a book that is also very formally inventive. Very famously, Billy Pilgrim is unstuck in time. The book is very fragmentary. It plays really pretty fast and loose with the idea of the narrator as also being an actual person, our actual author, the actual Kurt Vonnegut. And so in many ways, I was really primed to dive into a book like the Mobius Book, where Lacey is doing the same thing. So you can't talk about this book without talking about the cover and about how the book is actually set up. So the thing I first noticed when I saw it in the bookstore is that it's covered kind of like a library book. It's like those ones you would get from like interlibrary loan. There was something very kind of weirdly academic about the way the book actually felt in my hand. But the thing I noticed right away is we had the big barcode down at the bottom. Those of you on YouTube can see me holding it up here. The book itself is kind of a pretty blue color, but then it has this big barcode situation in white. And aesthetically, I did not really love that. After I read the book and I was preparing the lecture, I took a closer look at all of the elements, as I am wont to do. And I do think it's important that right above the little barcode, again, I'll show it to you if you're on the YouTube, it says fiction/memoir. So part of my process when I am approaching a book is to not do a whole bunch of reading about it beforehand. This book, the Mobius Book, was on a bunch of different lists, things you might want to read this summer. So I picked up the Mobius Book, and I certainly understood that you could start at either side. And I love this kind of book. I love the notion of playing with the physical object of a book and playing with our expectations. So I was excited. I picked it up, and I realized that, randomly, I was either going to start reading one or the other of these pieces of literature. I dove in. It turned out that I was reading the memoir, but because I had not looked very carefully at the boilerplate information, all of that stuff about the publication and the rights, the one that has like the little thing that says, this is a work of nonfiction, blah, blah, blah. I didn't read all of that stuff. I went ahead and I dove into this. And it was so interesting because I was reading it as if it were fiction, essentially as if it were maybe some sort of autofiction. In fact, as I was making my little notes, as I always do, I had a whole section of autofiction. Part of that was because she was using a lot of names of actual writers and talking about things that were happening in the real world in a way that felt to me like autofiction. And I'm kind of interested in this phenomenon. I mean, all of you Fox Page listeners who have been listening for a while know that my advice is just, if you want to be a better reader, just pay closer attention. And I could certainly argue to myself that I should have read all of that frontis matter. But I also think it was such an interesting experiment. So I went into this thinking it was going to be two pieces of fiction. And at some point I realized that what I was reading was in fact a memoir. And part of the interesting thing about this book, about the reading experience of this book, is that you never know as a reader if you are going to, you're going to start at one or the other. I suppose you could be very conscious about it and look and see which one is the fiction and which one is the nonfiction. But you obviously, or hopefully, you're going into it with enough intrigue and enough mystery that you don't really know which would be better. And obviously all of that's kind of an academic and not very interesting question because there is no way to know which is better. I did come away wishing that I had read the fiction first. And I'll try to articulate why as we are moving through. But I think the basic idea was that I found the fiction part more compelling, and I would have liked to have had that story in mind, the story of Edie and Marie and Kay, and I would have liked to have sort of backfilled. I feel like I would have held on a bit more to a lot of the information that we had gotten in the memoir. And frankly, I would have been weirdly more interested in the memoir, because I would be sort of backfilling all of these things in a story, the novella, that I felt was pretty compelling. And I think just the way that I'm describing this, the idea of wanting to kind of backfill information into the fiction piece indicates a little bit of my reaction to the book. My reaction, and it's very strange because this doesn't happen to me very often, I felt like the whole thing was sort of slippery. I couldn't quite figure out what I wanted to discuss with you all. The little notes that I always take in the back of the book, I take a little note of something that is interesting to me, and then I'll put page numbers that indicate the pages where I could go back and look at this aspect. They were kind of all over the place, and in fact, I didn't have as many as I usually do, which I think is notable because this is the kind of book actually where it seems like I would actually have a lot of that because of all of the idea of the fiction and the nonfiction working together, the formally inventive part of it, the idea of all the parallels you might find. It seemed like it would have been rich, and yet I came away, I enjoyed the reading of it, but I came away feeling a little bit like I hadn't quite apprehended the whole thing. What was really interesting is I then went on to listen to a bunch of interviews with Catherine Lacey, and I'm going to share some of that information with you today, but I found that really interesting. And of course, part of me in my formally inventive brain, I was sort of in that space. It was so interesting to listen to her discussed all of these different elements with various interviewers. Obviously, there's some things that kept repeating themselves, which is interesting unto itself. But I had this sense that I was adding a whole other layer on top of the memoir that sort of sits on top of the fiction, or, maybe the fiction is sitting on top of the memoir. And I felt like I was once again backfilling. I didn't actually know the name of her boyfriend. This is very much a roman à clé, like a novel where there are actual people in it. I'm doing that super obnoxious thing where I can't remember the word in English. I think there's a word in English, but I can only remember the word in French. There's also a word, tête bêche. There's a word for this kind of book in French, but I can't really think of it in English, which now I'm just off the deep end with the French posturing. But I didn't know most of these authors. Some of them I did, and I didn't know the name of the guy. Apparently it's very, it's a quick Google away to find out who the author is. I actually did go once I found his name. It's Jesse something or other. I read an interview that he did with someone, and he sounded like such an ass, which was actually very validating in many ways. So today is going to be a little different in the sense that we're not going to look quite so closely at the prose. Instead, we're going to look at the formal elements, the inventive nature of the book, because I think in many ways that is where the experience of reading it is most satisfying. So I always like to take a look at the title. Here the title is obviously very important. And because it's sort of so easily, not easily, but because it so obviously speaks to the formal invention, at first I hadn't gone very deep with it. In my mind, it was sort of just melded with the infinity symbol. Like I just had this sense that a Mobius strip is a thing that just keeps going. And you do have that sense. It's certainly something that keeps feeding on itself. On some of the jacket copy, there's a stuff about how it has, so many beginnings and so many endings, and there is really no beginning and no ending. And I actually don't really agree with any of that. I mean, I think there are two beginnings and I think there are two endings. And in many ways, these are two discrete pieces of writing that definitely have echoes with each other. But I didn't have a sense that it was sort of circular. For those of you who are looking for an actually circular novel, and maybe we should take a look at this, there is a book by Julio Cortázar called Rayuela. It was written in the 60s or 70s. Can't quite remember now. Hopscotch is the translation into English. That is a book where there have all these different chunks, all these different sections, and you can read it in any order. That to me feels much more like something that has no beginning and no end and is incredibly circular. It is such an amazing book. And maybe it's literary heavyweights like that who have done formal experimentation that I think is slightly more daring. that made this not quite as satisfying as it might have been. But in terms of the title, it is, the Mobius strip does in fact look like the infinity sign. Every time I'm thinking of it now, I think of Meta, and I'm just like so bummed out by the fact that like these corporations co-opt these things, and you can never quite think of, the infinity symbol, although they stretch theirs to look, I think, a little bit like an M. But these things never seem quite the same. But the thing that I realized when I sat down to dig a little deeper mentally into this book in preparation for talking with you all is the fact that when you look at a Mobius strip, you're seeing two sides of something. The Mobius strip is very mathematical. And I know this because I looked it up on Wikipedia, which I think is interesting, but not that interesting. Like I really could not delve at all into the mathematics of it. And I thought for a little bit about whether the mathematics had much to do with these two pieces of writing. And I don't really think it does. But the Mobius strip has a twist in it. And part of what I think we are meant to see when we are looking at the Mobius strip and when we are thinking about it in terms of this book is that you're seeing two sides of something. So it's not simply that there's no beginning and no end. It's that we're talking about two sides of the same thing. And that to me was much more significant and much more interesting than this idea of it being sort of circular. And if we really do conceive of this as sort of two sides of the same story, I think the fiction becomes much richer, and in fact, so does the memoir. And then, of course, if we take this idea of having a piece of writing that has two different sides, we can also think about that idea, the idea of things having two sides, in each of the books themselves, in a book that is really concerned with relationships. You have obviously the idea that there are two sides to every story. I mean, it's such a cliche that it actually is cliche. But here we're really playing in a very inventive way with this idea of every story having two sides. So in one of the interviews, they asked her very explicitly about the sort of relationship between these two things. And it was so interesting to me. So she suffers this breakup. And after the breakup, she can't write fiction and she can't read fiction for this very long amount of time. I mean, long being like 9 months or a year or something like that. And during that time, she's writing a lot like nonfiction stuff, but fragmentary. And all of that eventually becomes the memoir. I did this weird thing. There was a lot of talk about breakup, obviously, and there was a lot of talk about breakdown. And I started thinking about these phrases in English that all have to do with prepositions of location, things like up and down. And I got really interested in all of the different nuances. And I think it's very interesting that breakup and breakdown are in fact so close together. So in the memoir, what she is really focusing on is in fact this breakup. But what's more important in many ways is this idea of loss. She talks a lot in the interviews about the idea of losing things, of losing faith, of losing the relationship, of losing her house. And I already had thought actually a lot about religion and clearly about her loss of faith. But it was really nice to have her speak about the fact that for her, loss of faith and losses in general and grief over losses really is kind of the controlling idea of the memoir. I think because he's such an asshole and because there are a couple of scenes that he's just like such a dick. The part where he's like saying that she should lose weight, the part where he throws the book, the fact that he breaks up with her with an email, I mean, all of it is so egregious and so gnarly that it kind of really captivated me. That together with the religious parts, and actually I was pretty caught up in her narration of what it was to deprive herself. And the way that this kind of anorexia that she was experiencing came, in fact, from the Bible, that it had a lot to do with the Bible. I was interested in that. For whatever reason, I do not love reading about people's depictions of eating disorders. I mean, that sounds kind of obvious. As someone who had, little disordered eating at the end of high school, but who was very, very happy to have left that behind. There's something about it that seems, I hate to say this. This is like a terrible thing to say, but it feels kind of adolescent in this weird way. And just isn't quite as interesting to me as other elements of the book. I was interested, though, in the fact that she said in an interview that it was around the time that she lost faith, when she was about 20, that this urge to be depriving herself abated, and she was able to have like a more normal relationship with food and with her body. And in some ways, I was like, wow, lucky for her, and great that there was an endpoint. But also, it is so crazy to me that like a fairly literal reading of the Bible would convince a young woman that she is supposed to deprive herself so much. So I want to take a look at a quick little passage on page 21 because it speaks to this idea of circularity. It speaks to the idea that the book itself has these two halves and you can sort of read it from either direction. There's a certain looping kind of thing to it. But there also is that within the text. I'm laughing because I just picked up the book and I picked up the wrong side and I looked at page 21 and I was like, wait, where is my thing I'm supposed to read? And then I realized, in fact, that I was looking in the novella and I meant to be looking in the memoir. So she writes this in the memoir. When I wrote to Manguso to tell her of my trouble, she told me her spouse of 14 years had recently left her for another woman after a long affair. Everyone's breaking up these days, everyone kept saying. And though the ambient heartbreak had been no comfort, it was unpleasantly pleasant to learn of an ending more extreme than mine. It's a cyclical pain and a shared one. So I love so much about this. I love wow, couldn't get my glasses off there. I love the idea of it being circular. And I love this idea of a community experiencing this kind of cyclical thing. A couple of very interesting things here is that the circularity of it, the cyclical nature of the heartache, which is speaking, I think in many ways, it's kind of a fractal. It's like a repetition of the larger circularity of the book, the cyclical nature of the book. We go through everything twice in some ways in the book. But I like the way that she is underscoring the fact that it has to do with the ends of relationships, with this breaking up of relationships. And it's interesting just to step back a tiny bit and think about how often the end of a relationship is definitive. There is not circularity in terms of the relationship. So she's talking about something that feels cyclical because it's happening for people and it maybe happens to people over and over in their lives. And in that sense, it's a cycle. But each of the relationships that ends is, in fact, a discrete entity that is not circular. One other quick note here, she talks about Manguso. I did not know, that's Sarah Manguso, which I did read the acknowledgments because I always do. I like to do my literary sleuthing. But I have not read anything by Sarah Manguso, so that was not super resonant for me. But she actually quotes this woman, Manguso, and what she uses there is italics. In one of the interviews, she said that she doesn't like the idea of quotation marks. She is someone who did an MFA in nonfiction writing at Columbia, so she's someone who has done a lot of thinking about memoir. And she described how she doesn't love the idea of quotation marks because for her, they're really denoting something that is factual. It's something that you might have in journalism or some sort of reportage. Whereas in nonfiction, the idea of having dialogue written in italics is much more comfortable for her because it in fact doesn't signal kind of truth in quite the same way. So I mentioned before that today is going to be a little different in that we're not going to be doing a lot of like close textual analysis, but I do want to take a look at some of the prose, in part just to discuss what it is that we're dealing with here. I found her prose very effective, and it's always better in these discussions to have something concrete to hold on to. But I'm also reading these, obviously I'm reading specific parts. And of course, the parts that I'm selecting are very significant. We're going to look at pages 3 and 4 of the memoir. It's the opening of the memoir because it concerns a teacup. So one of the things that I think you do by human nature as you are reading these two things is you are looking for ties between the two. And the most obvious ties between the memoir and the novella are physical objects. I also found dates. I found the whole Christmas, the setting of the novella at Christmas time very revelatory because I was like, oh, I can map that onto the Christmas where our narrator in the memoir was with friends. And there are a bunch of different times where you're looking for specific physical objects. But the teacup to me was the one that stood out the most, maybe because in fact it is how we open the memoir. So we're going to take a look at pages 3 and 4. And honestly, we're going to have to spend a tiny bit of time on the first sentence because it's kind of a wacky one. So here's what we have. Odd impulse to catalog these days. Not that I can forget them. Not that I can remember them clearly. So I like the fact that right from the beginning we have this kind of circularity that she can neither forget nor remember them. We have this kind of philosophical contradiction. I have to say, some of the philosophy, some of the Seneca stuff, I think did resonate with me. But some of the stuff of Simone Weil, I think that's how you say her last name, it just felt like a little bit extraneous to me. I think incorporating philosophy into memoir is great, but it has to be done very carefully. But my problem with this very first sentence here, which it's kind of a bummer if you have a problem with the very first sentence, is that it can be read two ways. And maybe she did that intentionally, but I do not really think so. So we have this odd impulse to catalog these days, but it can also be read odd impulse to catalog these days, which is the way that I read it. I think because you don't usually catalog days. So my brain naturally was like, oh, wait, these days, she's having an urge to catalog things. I don't really know what. And then when she says, not that I can forget them, not that I can remember them clearly, honestly, I just felt some frustration. I was like, okay, well, she can't forget them, which doesn't have a lot to do with me, and she can't remember them clearly, which doesn't really instill a lot of confidence in me as a reader of memoir. But the biggest problem is this idea of the object in the first sentence, which is obviously meant to say, odd impulse to catalog these days. That is what she's cataloging. Usually I find her prose pretty precise and clear and easy to understand. And I mean, maybe she is meaning to sort of begin with this kind of doubt and this circularity and this double meaning and like the impossibility of cataloging days. But I did feel like we were beginning on shaky ground. Then things got much more clear. I awoke in the guest room, the attic, a guest in my own house, which I found very intriguing. I'm also very interested in this idea of domesticity. So she plays a lot with the idea of houses and domesticity and the ways that the public is allowed into her domestic spaces. I mean, she lives with her partner's mother. So in some ways, in many ways, that's kind of a normal domestic setting. But you do have this idea of their domestic space as having completely ruptured. But also, it's interesting to take a look at how it was formed in the beginning. For those of you who are out there wanting to become a better reader, it's always really important when you come across a house in literature to slow down and think about what it is saying about the people who live there. So obviously here in this house, she is totally alienated from the house. She's upstairs in the attic. She's in the guest room, which I was like, motherfucker, why can't that guy, if he's the one who wants to leave, why isn't he upstairs in the attic? But for whatever reason, she's up in the guest room. And I really think kind of symbolically, but also just like on a very gut level, it is so brutal that she is made a guest in her own home. Obviously, your own home is a place where you should be safe. It is a place where you should feel comfortable, where you can express yourself. And none of that is happening for her. Oh, and I'm going to interject a very important idea. One thing that was so interesting for me and a real eye-opener, and it's interesting that I didn't mention it before, and it might be because, happily, I have not had this experience, so I didn't relate to it quite as closely. But this idea of male anger, again, happily, not something I have dealt with personally very much. The idea of male anger as being so present, both in her family of origin and in this partnership with this man, that is this crazy incursion of violence into a domestic space. And I thought her depiction of this angry man in the house, there's that unbelievable line where she says, if you grew up with him, then you'll probably choose one for yourself. And if that one leaves, you'll find another. This idea of replicating these patterns of psychological and emotional and physical abuse, I find that very interesting. And I love the idea, love is a weird word to say here, but I love the idea of her really bringing us into the domestic very quickly and then showcasing this man who is in fact a monster. So we have her upstairs in her guest room. She is a guest in her own home. I'd never slept a night in that room, and staring up at the white clapboard ceiling and walls, I felt I'd been shrunk down and shoved into a doll's house. And I knew then, again, or for the first time, how grief expands as it constricts, how it turns a person into a toy version of herself. So whenever she throws in these things like again or for the first time and something expanding as it constricts, all of these things that feel kind of like physics things to me, I related them all to the idea of the Mobius strip, which is probably actually like a false relation that I was creating there. But I do think it's very interesting because she's trying to describe something elusive that she is trying to give us all of these different ways to think about it. It's also, of course, she's giving us kind of this fat metaphor here about her, having been shrunk down to doll size and that she is a toy, which is very telling in terms of her relationship with this person, but also this idea that throughout the memoir, she is going to be sort of shrunken down and she's going to revert back to a time when she maybe was playing with dolls. I mean, she wanted a skateboard, to be clear, which was awesome. But we have this idea of her regressing in some ways and becoming this kind of doll-like version of herself. So then we have, a man downstairs was the reason I'd turned from inhabitant to visitor. I really liked the way she used the reason throughout. That was excellent. My phone rang. The reason was calling me from the floor below. He wanted to know if I would say goodbye to him before I went to the airport. What have I been doing all week, I asked, if not saying goodbye to you? I hung up. Okay, first of all, loved the fact that she hung up. And I also love the fact that the pacing is interesting. Clearly, she's been up in this space for a week, but we don't have the minutia all of that, which I think is very good. She's starting the memoir at the point when she is leaving the house. So whenever you have a piece of fiction that is in the first person or a piece of nonfiction that is in the first person, you want to ask yourself, why is this person telling the story and why now? Clearly, Catherine Lacey is telling this story because she has a lot to say about male anger and the loss of faith and the Bible and the way that grief and loss is cyclical and how much we need to rely on our friends. All of that is very interesting. But the reason why it's happening now is because she's just had this horrendous experience of breaking up with someone she was with for 7 years. I think it was 7 years. You know why I think it was 7 years? This is terrible. I remember that expression, the 7-year itch, which is so, I mean, not to get all Mobius-y on you, but like that for some reason in my mind is like linked to the 7th inning stretch, which is just so bizarre. I mean, they obviously have nothing. Well, I mean, you know, they speak to the idea of like getting kind of cramped and then needing to stretch yourself. But the idea that there's a 7-year itch in any marriage just seems so insane to me. Like it seems so light and kind of like just like absolving anyone who at 7 years decides in fact that they like need out. Of course, in my mind, because it's something, it feels like it came from the 1950s. I feel like it's like some sort of like weird scapegoat that men get to say, oh, you know, it was a 7-year itch. And that this would be kind of like, you know, in the land of men, not so much in the land of women. But she's had this excruciating experience, and I really liked the fact that she was dropping us into the narrative right when she is leaving the home. And now we get to the part that has to do with the teacup. She just hung up on him, which was great. Before we bought that house, we lived in Berlin. The reason bought me an unreasonably expensive Japanese teacup. I felt the teacup was too nice to own, feared I would break it, and the reason often brought up the fact that I did not use the Japanese teacup often enough, that I obviously did not appreciate the teacup's beauty or the reason's generosity, but I thought I did appreciate that beauty, that generosity. And occasionally I told him so, but the reason insisted I did not, that I could not possibly feel appreciative based on my behavior vis-a-vis the teacup, so I began to think he was probably right, and I put my hopes toward truly becoming the person for whom this teacup had been intended. Someone who used it with frequency and pleasure, a person who didn't feel guilty about being given something so costly that she did not perhaps deserve, and I hoped to become this deserving person very soon, at some reachable point in the foreseeable future. So what I love so much here is the vulnerability that she is showing. I mean, she is really laying out the fact, not only that she is choosing to be with this guy who's a total asshole, but also that she is someone who does not think herself worthy of certain things. And what is so good at the beginning of a memoir of something that is this vulnerable and such a strong articulation of that vulnerability is that you as the reader, you're like, okay, this is someone who knows that, who understands that the problem in the beginning is that she doesn't think that she deserves nice things. It's also, of course, problematic that he's telling her things and she's like, I'm not sure that's right. And then he is convincing her. There's a lot of stuff in here about him gaslighting her, a lot of stuff about him convincing her, and we really see the ways that she wants to please him, which is so interesting because it's just feels so kind of reprehensible, but also understandable in the context of the memoir. So then we have these final two paragraphs. One afternoon during the days I lived as a guest in my home, I returned from a walk in the cold to find the reason sitting silently in the living room. I took the Japanese teacup from the cupboard, set it on the floor, took a hammer from the tool closet and set it beside the teacup. You have to break it, I told him, and after some hesitation, he did. So as you might imagine, I have a lot of thoughts about this. One is that there is this real sort of double-sidedness here. I really wanted her to take this teacup, which sort of symbolized the fact that he wanted her to be something that she was not, and that he would maybe give her things or gifts or parts of himself, but only, very conditionally. I wanted her to be the one to set the thing in front of him and then just smash it to pieces. And it's very telling that at this point in the breakup, she is in fact making him do this thing. And in some ways, I don't even really know how to interpret that, except that he is still the one who is in control at this point. And obviously, he wrote this crazy email where he said he was going off with some other woman, and it's only 7 days later. So obviously, our narrator is really not functioning very well. But I think there are also some interesting nuances about wanting him to face his anger, wanting him to understand that he is destroying her, at least his vision of her, And in one of the interviews, Lacey said this really interesting thing about how when we lose a relationship, we lose our sense of who we might be in that relationship and who we would be moving forward in that relationship. And in many ways, this teacup is totally representative of this idea. She was aspiring to be someone who thought she deserved these beautiful gifts and someone who, without a lot of cares, was using beautiful things. And she envisioned herself being able to become that person and moving forward as that person. And that illusion is now shattered. So we have this teacup at the very beginning of the memoir, which is important because anything at the beginning of the book is going to feel kind of momentous. And so then when we have teacups in the novella, and in fact, when we have a broken teacup in the novella, it feels very significant. So that teacup is not a special teacup, which is significant. It's just some sort of mass-produced, like not very well made, like not very interesting cup. Which in many ways, if we're going to look at that first teacup as this kind of special, beautiful thing that she aspires to want to use, and that also maybe represents, this illusion of what their relationship was all about and his power over her, then when we have this very kind of ordinary, more solid teacup, we have this sense of her maybe becoming more realistic about who she is, but this idea that we are not supposed to be reading these things one-to-one. It is not Catherine Lacey who is Edie in the story, although of course it is, and of course we are being invited to imagine all of these things. So if we are thinking of Catherine Lacey as being Edie, we have this idea of Edie having this kind of ordinary mug, and it is still shattered, but then very significantly, Edie herself brought some glue over to her friend Marie's house, and Edie herself is going to glue this thing back together. So we have this very, in some ways it should be like too heavy-handed, but it doesn't feel like that. At least it didn't to me. We have this, kind of extended metaphor of these teacups in these two different texts, and an extended metaphor even within the novella where it breaks, but then she is going to glue it back together. And then, very significantly, when the police come and she's pouring the water into it, all the water runs through like a sieve. So we get the sense, in fact, that this Edie, who is trying to piece her life back together and herself back together, it's not quite there. It's not quite there. She does, though, go and choose another mug. I did think it was interesting. Teacup, not that many people are using teacups. Like, I'm imagining like a very fine, like China teacup. And I think the idea of the Asian teacup being, a teacup sounds good. My sense is that when she is in Marie's apartment and she's taking down mugs from the cabinet, it's probably more of a mug and not so much a teacup. Although, of course, thank you, Catherine Lacey, for calling them both teacups so that you can alert your reader to the fact that there is this parallel. So this idea of me trying to piece together, and I think human nature is to piece together, look for these parallels between the memoir and the fiction piece. A lot of what we're doing there is taking a look at these narratives. So that sounds so obvious, but what I mean there is narrative in the broader sense. The idea that each one of these people, Edie, is a fictional character who has a very distinct narrative that Catherine Lacey is creating out of whole cloth, as they say. But even when we have the memoir, Catherine Lacey is providing the reader with an image of the narrator, of Catherine Lacey, that also is a narrative. So what I thought was so interesting is when you take these two things, these two narratives, one of them fiction and one of them nonfiction, with very identifiable elements that are inviting us to conflate Catherine Lacey with Edie, you have what I think the Mobius strip is meant to be, meaning that you have two sides of the same thing. So we have, when we're looking at it, we can sort of see both of them. And I, as a reader who has read both of them, I have both of them in my head. And they're not quite, they're not the same thing, but they're sort of circular in the sense that I'm envisioning them together. If there is an entity, a person, Catherine Lacey, in the world, and she writes a narrative, a memoir that is not congruent with her, it is not actually her, obviously, it is a depiction of her that she has chosen to put out into the world, we have that version, and then we have this kind of fictionalized version that I think we are invited to see as another. It's not supposed to be, obviously, it's not supposed to be factual, because she's very explicitly putting the two things together. So in one of the interviews, they were asking her this very obvious question about why are these two things together? And what she said, I have to say, I was intrigued by it, but I'm not sure that I was fully convinced that that these two things really, I don't think that either of them stand alone. I don't think they work alone. But I have a sense of the novella as being a little bit calculated, which is fine. So what Lacey said is this, that when she experienced that breakup, she couldn't read any and she couldn't write any fiction for a long period of time. But then eventually she realized that all of the things she was writing during that period could be put together into this memoir. But then when she had the memoir finished, she had this sense that something was missing from it. And I'm not sure, I said I didn't think that they worked separately. I'm not really sure. I don't know. I get the sense, I don't think that's a memoir that I would be dying to read on its own. And I don't think it would be getting all of the celebration that it is if it did not, in fact, have this element, the kind of formally inventive part. But so she had this idea that it wasn't quite finished. And then she described being in a retreat, a writer's retreat, and working on this thing, this idea that she had for this novella, working on it 10 hours a day, sort of 7 days a week, and that it really came very quickly to her. To me, it does feel like something that could have been written in a short span of time, partially because it's just brief, but also because there's kind of a propulsion, this idea of it happening all in one evening, the idea of this very compelling and neat arc about the murder. All of that does seem like something that might have happened pretty quickly. But I think what's most interesting about that is this idea, and she spoke to this in the interviews, that the narrative of Edie, in many ways, is kind of poking holes in the idea of the narrative of Catherine Lacey in the memoir. She spoke very clearly about the fact that Marie and Kay, who are some of Edie's oldest friends, they are challenging this narrative that Edie has of herself. So if we are assuming that Edie is being gaslit by some guy, her friends can see that this narrative that she is telling herself is false. And so there's this playing with narrative that is really sophisticated in terms of how it is embodied in this book. So you have the narrative of the memoir, but then you also have the narrative of this novella, and the whole thing is kind of testing the idea of narrative in general and the extent to which we need to interrogate the different narratives that we are developing and telling ourselves and the ones that we are hearing from our friends. That part of the book was so interesting to me. So I want to end on a note from the Los Angeles Review of Books interview. This was so fascinating to me. This is kind of one of those extension of the novel kind of meta experiences. So one of the interviewers from the Los Angeles Review of Books was asking Catherine Lacey about the dog. And I had done a lot of thinking about the dog. So in the novella, she has this experience with this dying dog. And to me, I wasn't like, oh, this is obviously a stand-in for God, but there was some sense of this creature as being kind of otherworldly and as being kind of an authoritarian figure and as a sort of speaking through her in a very godlike kind of way. But I did have a lot of questions about the dog, so I was really happy because one of the interviewers was like, can you talk to us about the dog? And her response was so interesting. What she said is that during that residency, during this kind of fevered work, she said that all sorts of stuff comes up, and she wasn't really even sure what the dog was. She doesn't know how to explain it. And I liked that in some ways, the idea that that is open to interpretation. It seemed to her very much a part of the narrative that she was telling and seemed very crucial. And I both kind of loved the idea that she wasn't sure what it meant. And I also felt a little bit frustrated. I was a little like, wait, you still don't know what it means? I would love to actually have your take on what you think it means. And then this crazy thing happened where the Los Angeles Review of Books woman said that in her mind, it was a parallel, the dying dog, was a parallel to the time when in the memoir, Catherine Lacey stops to help the man who is lying face down on the sidewalk. And it was so fascinating. I had not made that parallel. And the crazy thing is neither had Catherine Lacey. And it was so refreshing to me because she was like, oh my God, I have never thought of that. I don't think she said, oh my God, like that. But it was so interesting because I had this sense that we have this memoir and we have this piece of fiction. And then on top of that, we have the author of both of those things who is not entirely understanding them, who is hearing theories from other people that are creating different narratives about these two narratives. It was so amazing and kind of odd and excellent. And I think it's a good place to end because this Mobius book really is, it's about loss and it's about violence and it's about grief and it's about COVID. It's about many, many different things. It's about friendship among women. It's about friendship more broadly. It's about spiritualism. But what I will take away most is this idea that it is very much about narrative. And there's a lot of talk these days about narrative, and I think we need to be careful with our narratives. And I think this entire project is really underscoring the power of the stories that we tell. So I really enjoyed reading the book, but I also really, really enjoyed this deep dive into the Mobius book. I hope that it's, maybe it's just like inspired more questions for you, which is also appropriate. But hopefully it's answered some questions and has maybe given you even a little more to think about and a little more to take away from this reading experience. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.